Good day to you, or buenos dias, as they say in Mexico. And I'm standing on the street that's in front of my house, and you wouldn't know it, but this street is actually full of Canadians. Yeah, in fact, right across the street from me, right over there in that house with that big tree in the front of it, there's a couple of people from Canada, and they've moved down here full time. In fact, there's a lot of Canadians all over Mexico. It's one of the great undiscovered secrets to Mexico. It's not actually Mexican immigrants coming into the US. It's the only way that the immigration is traveling. That there's a big population of Americans, or gringos, as they say, and Canadians down here. But right now, the Canadians, they can't get to Mexico because in their country, they're not permitted to travel while the pandemic is at the state it's at in Canada. And when Canadians do come down here, they're often mistaken for Americans. You know, what's that like to go into a store and have somebody ask you, "Are you American?" "No, I'm Canadian." And actually, Canadians are American, right? They live in North America. So that term American is not just the property of the United States. And I'm introducing this information because it's going to get at our chapter today, because we're talking about Canadian media, and we're talking in many ways about an asymmetrical relationship between Canadian media and American media. It's lopsided, right? It's in the favor of the United States, a much bigger country. And so many people who are Americans, they're not even aware very much of Canada, despite the fact that if we're living in the Poconos, we're only 6.5, 7 hours away from Canada. More people have been to Disney than they go to Canada, even though Disney's farther away. Most of you in this class probably couldn't answer who is the Prime Minister of Canada. Can you answer who that is without looking it up? I mean, maybe you know it's Justin Trudeau, but most of you don't. And why is that? Why don't we know much about Canada? It's because of this asymmetrical relationship that's described in our book, where we're really not getting a lot of media content out of Canada. You don't see Justin Trudeau featured in sitcoms in the United States or dramas. I don't mean acting on them. I mean people referring to them, making a reference to whoever the prime minister is. But you'll see people making a reference to President Biden in Canadian media. It's an example of the asymmetrical relationship between the two countries, and it's a relationship that we're going to study in this chapter with our northern neighbor. Most of you know the Great White North. You know, people say when they end their sentences in Canada. You know, they love hockey, they love beer. But what else do you know about Canadians? Their population is dwarfed by ours. We have some 340 million people, and Canada, last I looked, was right around 50 million people. I mean, maybe higher, but the ratio there is really, really exaggerated. There are many more people than the U.S., and most Canadians are living on the border of the U.S. as well. So we have this giant, the United States, a giant that's an economic giant, a giant that's a political giant, a giant that's a giant in terms of media production, and then you have Canada trying to fight off all this because they don't want American cultural imperialism. So we're picking up on a concept that we talked about last time. American cultural imperialism is like invading a country, right? And that country's culture starts to get diminished. So let's get into more material from the chapter. I'm going to try and highlight the areas that I think are most important or most interesting to me. And we're talking about American cultural imperialism. At the same time, we're going to be talking about the globalization of Canadian media industries, because Canada's media industry, if you read the chapter, is gone beyond Canada. It's taking place in other countries. Canadian media production. That's one of the dimensions that we're going to be handling here. If we look back to a significant year in the development of the relationship between Canada and the United States in terms of media and the problems that Canadians have with American media diluting their values and their customs, we can look at the year 1949. In 1949, the Canadian federal government did a study of mass media in the country, and they came up with a policy that has since morphed into many policies, and it has a comprehensive reach to it across many dimensions in media production. The policy basically has to do with preserving Canadian identity in media and not letting that identity be dwarfed by the American identity, which is really the United States identity. So let's get some other factors on the table about Canada. I mean, it's a pretty impressive country. For example, it has the 10th largest economy in the world. and it's the second biggest country in the world after Russia. So 10th biggest economy, second biggest country. It's a country of great importance size-wise. It has actually 50 of the world's top 500 big companies, and many of those are media companies. In fact, the 5 big media companies in last class, we referred to these as conglomerates. These are companies that have been benefiting from policies in Canada to let them grow and develop and build up. They get tax credits, for example, and so that they can rival big American media companies like Fox or like ESPN or like Disney. And so these big 5 companies in Canada, you've got BCE, which is sounding to me like it's coming from British Columbia. That's on the western side of Canada. Canada's so big. Rogers is another company. TELUS is another company. Shaw is another company. And then Quebeco, which has to be that francophone-based company in Quebec. These are the 5 big Canadian media conglomerates, and then they have lots of subsidiary companies as well. They're encouraged to grow, to promote Canadian media products around the rest of the world, and also to fight back the current of American products flowing across the border, with 90% of the population living, right? You can't control a TV signal, right? If you live in Buffalo, New York, and if you live across in Canada on the Niagara side, across from Buffalo, you can't stop a Buffalo TV signal from coming into Canada. And so that's the dilemma for Canadians, right? There's going to be a natural appetite amongst Canadians for American programs. In fact, moving on to the next subject addressed by the chapter that has to do with this border crossing of media content between the 2 countries, is basically a one-way flow. And this is an issue that has permeated lots of other countries' discussions about media policy around the world, the one-way flow that goes on between Western nations and non-Western nations, that goes on between rich nations and not so rich nations, that goes on between Northern Hemisphere countries and Southern Hemisphere countries. What I'm talking about is the flow of media is not equal. It's not 2-directional. It's more one-directional. And it creates problems of imperialism. It creates problems of in the host country of developing the means to produce media content if you're pulling it in from other countries all the time. And also it creates a misidentity problem for many countries, that they are known not by what they are telling the rest of the world through their own media, that countries are instead known by other country media covering those countries and then telling the rest of the world what those countries are like through the eyes of that media. We have no further to look than Mexico, which many of you will consider to be a very dangerous place. You're probably thinking right away, don't drink the water at one level, and you're probably thinking about drug cartels at another level, and you know about El Chapo. Everybody knows El Chapo. There's a Netflix documentary right now. It's produced in the United States. There's several documentaries on El Chapo. One of them involves a Mexican telenovela star who led to the capture of El Chapo because he befriended her. And so what I'm doing is I'm talking about one tiny example of media content produced in the United States, which is portraying Mexico, right? And how's it portraying Mexico? It's portraying it not the Mexico that I see when I go out here and I see peaceful street, flowers on the street. I see somebody delivering water. I see people going for walks. That's not the Mexico that you think of, right? That's the problem that we're talking about with one-way flow of information. And that's why you think of Lebanon as a dangerous place, and Syria as a dangerous place, and Cuba as backwards. That's because the flow of information is not in favor of those countries telling their own story. It's about what we are telling about those other countries through our own media. I thought this was interesting that in 2016, it's 5 years old now, but in 2016, the top 10 TV shows in Canada are American. They were American. Okay, so people are choosing to watch American. They want to see the NFL. They want to see the CSI. They want to see Dancing with the Stars. And also on the web. I mean, we have to talk about web media in this class. It's not just legacy media. On the web, the top 15 most visited websites in Canada, top 15, they're all American. So you can see what Canada's up against to try and preserve Canadian identity, to try and forge Canadian identity. It's a young country, right? It didn't even have a constitution until 1982. And it's experiencing a lot of immigration coming into that country. So still trying to figure out what it is. Some of the biggest TV shows that Canada has been successful in exporting, right? Because they're not just developing media for their own country, they're wanting to export media around the country. They've got really big shows like Degrassi. Many of you probably grew up on that show as kids. Schitt's Creek, spelled Schitts, Schitt's Creek. It's a comedy. You find it on Netflix. A big crime drama called Cardinal is exported all over the world. Those are some of the examples. And our pop culture is riddled with Canadian stars. Shania Twain, for example, or Justin Bieber. They're Canadians, and they kind of become American when they come over here, right? Vancouver in Canada is known as Hollywood North. Hollywood North because there's a lot of encouragement through policy and tax credits and financing and favorable currency exchange rates between the Canadian dollar and the American that are offered to companies to come to Canada and do TV production there. So Vancouver is known, film production is known as Hollywood North. And Toronto is also a big city that's used for film production as well. I know many rock and roll bands go to rehearse in Toronto, and they're production studios in Canada that are very available. So we have what we're talking about here is a decided Canadian policy where government, industry, and people are all trying to do something to prevent the Canadian identity from being submerged underneath American identity. They're doing that on a number of fronts, including encouraging production to be taking place in their country. Then also they have a lot of policies that have to do with regulating how much ownership can take place, foreign ownership of a Canadian company. It's 20% of a Canadian media company. It's the maximum amount that can be owned by a foreign company. And so it's limiting imperialism in that way too. And last class I mentioned that Canada restricts how much American radio songs can be played through the French language speaking requirement, making sure that X amount of songs, X amount of content is Francophone and Canadian based. And so what we have here is a country that is still in the process of figuring out how far it wants to go with these policies in trying to correct an asymmetrical relationship between the United States. But we can say that in the last, 10 years, much Canadian media content has exploded onto the international scene. It has become globalized. It's both going global and also content is being produced in Canada that has some foreign influences, even though it's being done under the guise of what Canada is looking for. So that's going to wrap up our chapter on Canada today. I hope you have a wonderful day.